Hi, this is Chuck Gallagher. And, every choice we make in life has a consequence of some sort. However, sometimes the things that come up in life can catch us a little bit off balance. Things happen that we're not necessarily expecting or can be potentially prepared for. And my guest today is the CEO and founder of PCaAware. His name is Dennis Golden. Now, Dennis and I have two things in common. Both of us are professional speakers, but the thing that most profoundly connects us is both of us also happen to be prostate cancer survivors. And so with that said, I have to start by saying I admire Dennis for taking the initiative to increase and raise awareness relative to prostate cancer. There are well over 200,000 men in the United States that are diagnosed with prostate cancer every year. That is probably the number one diagnosis of cancer for men in the United States, and yet something that men don't tend to find themselves talking about. So as we begin exploring the concept of prostate cancer and what we really need to be aware of, let's just jump in, Dennis, and talk a little bit about your background with prostate cancer and what brought you to the point of being the CEO and founder of this incredible nonprofit organization.
Well, what happened with me is, like everyone else, I was going for my annual physical every year and thought I was doing a great job. And then somewhere, at the end of 2012, my GP said to me, your PSA's up a little bit, and you might want to go get checked by a urologist. And so I went and got checked by a urologist and discovered pretty quickly that he thought I might have had an issue. And after we did a biopsy, I sure enough discovered I did have an issue. And then was really presented with a couple of options. One was surgery, and the other was radiation. And at that particular point, you're the most uninformed decision maker in the room. And you're trying to make this decision on where you're going to go. And you begin looking around a little bit to find out who else has had this disease and what information is out there. And what I discovered was that an awful lot of men really have no idea at all. In fact, I think the number is something like 47% of men have any idea if they even have a prostate and what some of the dangers are. So there seemed to be a tremendous need for education and information to go out to men. Because let's face it, Chuck, men don't really like to go for annual physicals. They think it's a waste of time. And they figure that prostate cancer is not a dangerous disease. And yet they don't realize that over 30,000 men a year actually die from the disease as well. So it was time to do something. And that's really what we wanted to do.
Dennis, it's interesting. You sound like, when you were talking a minute ago, you sound like the guy who is, I'm going to go for my annual physical, and this is what you do, and this is how life exists. Just to contrast to that, for those people that are watching or viewing this, I'm a prostate cancer survivor, but Dennis, I'm going to be the first to admit, I'm not the guy that goes for the annual physical. I felt like I was pretty healthy. I do the physical every once in a while because it's probably appropriate, or the doctor nudges me along. But to contrast to this, in my case, I went to my doctor, and I was 47 at the time. Now, as this is being recorded, I'm 58, so it's been a number of years. But I went to the doctor and I said, I want Propecia. And she looked at me and I said, look, you and I have a difference here. You're more hair challenged than I am, and I didn't want my hair to fall out. And so, this pill supposedly kept your hair from falling out. And she looks at me, quite the attractive doctor, I might add. And she says, well, I'm going to have to do a blood test. And I'm like, why? I hate needles. She said, well, because it will artificially lower your PSA. And my question was, what's that?
Exactly.
I had no clue what a PSA was, what its relevance was, don't know that it was ever measured. And so I guess Dennis, the way I would put it is my vanity got in the way of my dissatisfaction with needles. They found out my PSA was a little high. It was 4.7. She said,
That's a little high.
well, for somebody your age, 4 is kind of the number, she said. So maybe I should send you to a urologist. Went to the urologist. He said, I don't think you've got a problem, but we probably should do a biopsy. Now, I got to quickly ask you a question. Dennis, when you had your biopsy, did you get any medication to help with pain?
Actually, I did. I was petrified. I had read a little bit about it, and some of the stories I heard, I was actually quite concerned. And the hospital that I went to, fortunately, said, "Oh yeah, we give you a little bit of like something you'd use in your teeth, so it'll feel like a rubber band snap." Well, they didn't tell me quite how big the rubber band was going to be.
I know this is going to sound bizarre and it's a little off track, but I would love for you or I one to speak at a urology convention and tell the urologist, you go have one without anything and then come back. I mean, because look, if you're going to have a colonoscopy, they put you out with propofol. I think they should put everybody out with propofol that's having a biopsy, because that sucker hurts. There's just no ifs, ands, or buts about it.
It does get your attention.
But in your case, you were diagnosed because they felt the PSA might have been a little high. In my case, was that the case?
Yeah, it was. And what I never realized is something that they call PSA velocity. My PSA had been going up just a little bit at a time. And your general practitioner really doesn't know that much about prostate cancer, which I didn't realize. So as the number started to approach 3, he said, well, maybe now is the time to do something. And actually, I should have been involved with probably going to a urologist way before that. But again, the doctor didn't know, I didn't know. And again, probably 90% of men don't know what to do.
Right. Well, for both of us, I think it's safe to say that the experience we had after the biopsy and the discovery of prostate cancer was similar. You went to your doctor, I went to mine. They broke the news probably fairly straightforwardly. You have prostate cancer. And then they proceed to tell you, here are your options.
Right.
And it was, for me, and I think probably, Dennis, the same for you, matter of fact, straightforward, here are your options. This is what we suggest, and we can schedule you at X.
That's correct. Absolutely. And you're sitting there absolutely shell-shocked as to what this information is. And for them, they handle this so often that it's very routine. So you're reacting internally, they're giving you information, and you hear about half or a third of what they're saying.
Absolutely. Now, the thing that I'm going to say it this way. My first response to the doctor was, I need to go home and think about this. Second, like you said, you begin to look to see what information is out there. And Dennis, I think you would agree with this. Women tend to be a whole lot better than men. Women deal with the issue of breast cancer, and they're really open to talking about the experience and what's happened and what works and what doesn't work. And it's almost that willingness to share to help other people. But men don't tend to fall into the category of, okay, gee, let's share something that is related to, obviously part of our body, but also the part of our body that will ultimately deal with continence issues and erectile functions. That's generally not the kind of thing we typically will talk a lot about.
Well, the whole thing, I think, even going for a physical examination, having a digital exam, men don't like to be put in that position. It's a feeling of vulnerability. And I think when you begin to talk about this disease, you're talking about issues that are below the belt. And for many men, that defines who they are and what they are almost as much as their job does. So it's something that they really don't like to admit they have a problem. And I've known men who have had prostate cancer and who haven't even wanted to have it treated because they didn't want to impact anything that might have to do with sexual relations.
Right. So both of us have had a very similar experience. I think one of the things that PCaAware does is opens the door for some very practical discussions to take place to help people become much more aware of what needs to happen and how that needs to take place when first diagnosed with prostate cancer. And I want to say, at least from my perspective, and I want you to chime in with this, but unless you have been diagnosed with a very aggressive form of prostate cancer, which is not the typical diagnosis, the one thing that really struck me quickly was the doctor wanted to schedule, in his case, he wanted to schedule surgery, and we'll do that 2 weeks from now, almost as if the fear of having it created some incredible urgency, when in reality there was no urgency to take immediate action. There was plenty of time to consider all of the options, all of the alternatives, and to prepare yourself physically and mentally for whatever form of treatment you choose. And I think that's one thing that really men need to know. Don't rush into making a decision.
Well, exactly. And I think what happens is, as soon as you hear the word cancer, I know I speak to many men at many men's groups, and the feeling many times is the word cancer is a scary situation. And men say, what I want to do is get this out as soon as I can. The other side of it is you have to also recognize, and we've done a couple of programs with some of the big pharmaceutical companies. And one of the things that you realize is that prostate cancer is a disease, but it is also a very lucrative business. When you have hospitals competing against each other, you'll find that some hospitals really specialize in radiation, and guess what they'll suggest to you? Hospitals will do surgery, and they'll suggest surgery. Others will do something with seed implantation. So each one has its own sort of methodology. You also have to remember that some of these hospitals have made tremendous investments in equipment, and that equipment is sitting there. So whether it's robotic surgery equipment or whatever it might be, there is a desire by the administration to make that investment, if you will, pay off. So your surgeons are saying, well, this makes some sense to do robotic surgery or radiation, and it's good for the patient, perhaps, but maybe there's another alternative. Maybe you should be watchful waiting, rather than going in immediately for surgery or radiation or treatment.
You know, Dennis, I think that's really valid. And just to augment that, you see this so much. You're diagnosed, the urologist diagnoses you, and whatever typically their bent is, if their bent is towards surgery, or they're connected with a surgery center, or likewise with radiation oncology. That is not to say, to be clear, that doesn't mean that all doctors are motivated only for their gain, but it is absolutely true. If you are diagnosed with prostate cancer, if you go to a surgeon, they will lean toward surgery. If you go to a radiation oncologist, they will lean toward radiation. And the fact is, probably some of the first best advice for men is to stop, step back, and shop. Find out what the gain, what the benefit is to surgery versus radiation versus watchful waiting versus high intensity focused ultrasound or other methodologies that are out there, proton beam radiation, for example, but to find out what are the advantages, disadvantages, and what likely is best for my case. Not what's best for the doctor, but what's best for me.
Oh, absolutely. And you know, one of the things, we talk about watchful waiting. Now they've actually changed it to active surveillance, because so many guys would get prostate cancer or receive a diagnosis and also be under the impression that it's not a serious disease. You've heard many times that if you're going to get cancer, one of the best ones to get is prostate cancer because it's not serious. And that's a myth that's out there that many men don't realize. And it impacts your life in any number of ways. So there's a balance that needs to be had between looking for information, trying to find information, and then trying to pick out what options you want really for treatment. One of the big difficulties is that when you go on the internet and you start to find information, you're going to find contrasting information that many times is contradictory, very difficult to understand, and it can scare the living devil out of you in terms of other men's experiences. So there's a desire for information, and yet at the same time, getting too much information is really scary, you know?
Well, it is, and I think probably you hit on something that's very important. You know, there's lots and lots of stuff on the internet. The question is, where is it coming from? And what's the motivation of the organization that's putting the information out? I don't know. I don't know, and I'm interested to find out. I don't know exactly what your experience was. I will say in my case, now keeping in mind I was diagnosed in 2004. And just a side note, the urologist diagnosed me and he said, you know, you're a young man, so surgery is the gold standard. And he said, so we can schedule this in 2 weeks. And I'll never forget, Dennis, I looked at him and I said, okay, but let me ask you a question. How many of these surgeries do you do? He said, well, I typically do 2 to 3 a week. Now, I can't speak for other people, but I thought, well, if all you're doing is 2 to 3 a week, maybe I need somebody that does 2 or 3 a day. There's just something that says to me, it's like this. If I played golf twice a week, I would not be a professional golfer. If I'm a professional golfer, I'm playing 7 hours, 8 hours, 12 hours a day, probably 5 days a week, because that's how I'm going to improve my skills. So the first thing I said was, in Hickory, North Carolina, is this my best option?
Right. No, I hear you. In my own case, too, I went in, I talked to the surgeon. I brought my wife with me, which was good because she heard a lot more information than I did. But in conversations with the doctor, I had said to him how many surgeries had he done, and he had done over 4,000 surgeries.
Right.
So I felt pretty comfortable with it. Then I also discovered I up in Connecticut in the Hartford area, and I was discovering that people were coming out of New York City to come up to Hartford Hospital to have surgery done. And so with some of the facilities that are in New York, and I'm figuring these guys have to be pretty good up here. And surgery I had was, it worked very well. I had the robotic surgery, and recovery was great. I was almost shocked by how easy it was. And it so far has worked fairly well.
Well, so let's talk a little bit about that, because both of us, as men explore and think about it, both of us had the same actual treatment, robotic surgery. Now, yours was, did you say it was 2012?
Yeah, I was actually diagnosed in 2012, had the surgery in August 15, 2013.
Okay.
So about 3 years ago as of this date.
Okay. So yours was 2013. At the time I had robotic surgery, it was in 2005, and there were only 4 machines in the country, and one of them was at Johns Hopkins. So I went to Johns Hopkins to have the surgery done. And I will tell you, I'm going to say this, I don't get any money for it, but it was just a true statement. I could not have asked for nicer people. I went for a consultation. They looked at the information that came back from the, initial biopsies. Looked at that information, spent time with me, never rushed. I was amazed at the length of time they were willing to take. And like you, the surgery went fine. Now, I'm going to suspect your surgery might have lasted less than mine. For whatever reason, my surgery actually lasted 7 hours.
Well, I was 5 hours, so yes, you beat me.
Okay. Now, I hear a lot of guys that, the surgery's 2 hours, maybe 3, and that's kind of it. So for those people that are watching this, the surgery can be 2 to 3 hours, or it can be 5 to 7 hours. Ideally, what you've got is a surgeon who is not concerned with the speed of the surgery, but the quality of the result.
Absolutely.
Now, one of the things that I suspect is that when you go in, and if surgery is the choice that you're making, one of the questions that we would have as men is, are you going to be able to do nerve-sparing surgery? For those people that are watching this, the nerves that connect our body to the ability to have an erection, those nerves literally lay on top of the prostate. So if this is the prostate, the nerves are laying on top of it. And so in my case, for 47 years, those puppies just laid there and it was quite comfortable and they were just happy as a little lark and everything worked fine. But then all of a sudden they come in and they take the prostate out. And to me, it's like a cat being put in water. It goes like that. And the nerves are freaking out because it's like, what just happened? You cannot guarantee that the doctor who is performing the surgery is going to be able to spare the nerves because they're going to determine that based upon what they find when they go in. But as compared to men 30 and 40 years ago, before a nerve-sparing technique was invented, prostate cancer and surgery for that meant immediately the ability to be impotent. That does not mean that today.
No, it does not. And that is one major change that has happened thanks to the robotic surgery and thanks to the improvements that are being made. Now,
Dennis, a friend of mine, well, let me back up a second. My surgery was in 2005, and 4 weeks later, I packed my bags in North Carolina, hopped on an airplane, flew to Dallas, Texas, and took a brand new job. You know, and I know that surgery today, for the most part, there are obviously going to be a few exceptions, but for the most part is reasonably simple, and the recovery rate is pretty dramatic, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I had the surgery, and the following day the surgeon came in and said, you can go home. And it was almost shocking in how quickly it was. Within 2 weeks after the surgery, they put a catheter in. 2 weeks after the surgery, that was out. Within 4 weeks, I was back riding a bike. And within 6 weeks after that, I was out kayaking. So, I mean, your recovery is amazing, really.
Right. Now, for those people who are watching this, some people might ask the question, well, okay, guys, wait a minute. You're talking about different forms of treatment, but both you guys had surgery, so why wouldn't I have surgery? And I think the answer to the question, to some extent, depends upon the severity of your prostate cancer. And the other side to it would be perhaps what your age is, and therefore what your body physically can stand, whether it can handle the surgery or if there is something that is more practical. For example, a good friend of mine back in North Carolina at 73 was diagnosed with prostate cancer. Now, at his age, the question was, well, what is the appropriate treatment? And he considered surgery, he considered radiation, and concluded that radiation less on his age likely would result in the substantial elimination of his prostate cancer. And yet at the same time, based on normal life expectancy, his life expectancy was not practically going to be much more than 10 years, basically. I mean, we're living a bit longer these days. So the issue for him was, why would I put myself through surgery when I, in fact, can have radiation? It's a functionally painless experience. It can eliminate the prostate cancer and not negatively impact my quality of life. I will not likely die from prostate cancer if I have radiation at that age.
Well, it's the end result of surgery and the end result of radiation over time is the same. In terms of the same type of impact that it can have. There are people who have had radiation, who have cancer come back. It is at that particular point you can't operate, or very difficult to operate. If the cancer does come back, it's a very difficult situation. So long-term impacts of radiation can be incontinence the same way, and there can be almost the same issues as though you had surgery. So it really is a matter of looking at the situation in terms of the surgery, looking at radiation, saying, what do I feel more comfortable with? The idea, the name of the game is to really rely on your physician to make that recommendation, and for you then to say, what seems to make sense for me? What am I willing to tolerate? Now, I think, Chuck, you had radiation following your own surgery, and that's not a simple process. I think you might want to talk a little bit about the fact that it isn't a situation where you go in one day, have surgery, radiation, and leave. It's a little more prolonged process.
It is. And Dennis, in my case, I had surgery in 2005. That, of course, that means the prostate was removed. And my PSA, of course, went to functionally 0. And it's kind of funny. I mean, it was 0, it was 0, it was 0, it was 0. It got to the place where it's like, what the point is going to having a PSA test? I'll do it every 6 months. No big deal. Moved from Texas to North Carolina, then South Carolina. Found a doctor in South Carolina. And long story short, apparently my PSA started to rise. Now, he thought nothing of it, because as a general practitioner internist, he was looking and he said, well, here's this 50-some-year-old and he's got a PSA of 0.5. I mean, that's irrelevant. I mean, that's nothing. He wasn't paying attention to the fact I didn't have a prostate.
Exactly.
That, by the way, was a wake-up call. And how I found out that prostate cancer had come back, at least to some extent, was I applied for life insurance. And the insurance company turned me down. And I was like, what? It's been 7 years, for goodness sake, since this surgery. What are you turning me down? And they said, well, the chance you live 20 years is slim to none. And I'm like, why? I said, because your PSA is rising and you don't have a prostate. And at the time, my PSA was 0.8. So, I called the doctor and I said, dude, my PSA is 0.8. Well, what's up with this? And he said, that's great for a guy your age. I said, yeah, if I had a prostate. And it was almost like he went to Casper the Friendly Ghost. Because you could tell the color draining from his face, because he recognized, oh, crap, I haven't diagnosed something right. And from March of 2014 to June of 2014, it went from 0.8 to 1.2. So I received what is referred to as salvage radiation, which is radiation treatment following the surgery that I had, almost 9 years earlier. And you're right, it is not a simple process. It took 36 daily treatments, 5 days a week for 36 days. Now, was it painful? No. But Dennis, you and I both made a choice at the very beginning to have surgery. And probably what went through your head is what went through mine. And that was, I can have surgery and that may cure me. But if it were to come back, radiation is a great follow-up treatment.
Absolutely.
If I had started with radiation, surgery would not have been an option, as you pointed out earlier.
Right. There are some specialists around the country that do it, but they are specialists and they're very hard to find. And it's a very iffy situation, even going through that process. So for me, I feel like when I was 47, I made the right choice to have surgery, because then in 2014, 9 years later, when I was at the time 56, I had then radiation, and again, it wasn't painful, but 36 treatments later, my PSA started dropping like a rock, and now has dropped to 0, because functionally the radiation was a great second alternative in the event that there was a slight recurrence in prostate cancer. Well, that's really great news that worked that way for you. And the recurrence of prostate cancer, even after surgery, is about 30%. So it's, and especially if you've had an advanced case of prostate cancer, an aggressive case, the chances for that to come back. But I think the biggest news for men is, if you get tested, you go in early, you get treated. If it comes back, there are other treatment options, and there are many options. And there's really no reason today for men to die of prostate cancer. But the idea here is to catch it early. And that's one of the reasons that we try to stress so much of guys in their 40s should be getting a PSA test, should be going in. And the youngest cases we see are men in their 30s with prostate cancer. Now, it's unusual, but does it happen? Yes, it does. So it's really something that guys need to be aware of. And that's what PCaAware is about. Go in, get yourself tested, understand what's going on, understand your options, and if something occurs, for God's sakes, talk about it and talk to other men about it and find physicians. And as you pointed out earlier, don't jump into anything too quickly, but really give yourself some time to digest it and then move forward with whatever plans you have.
You know, Dennis, again, I want to say back to you, I applaud you for taking the initiative to form PCaAware, this nonprofit organization. And let's talk a little bit about how PCaAware can work to raise awareness and issues so that men have a good resource to go to and to look to provide awareness and education.
Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, when we started originally, we looked and we said that there were organizations that concentrated on new drugs that were coming out, new treatments. So that was one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum, you had organizations that dealt almost exclusively with men who had had prostate cancer and then what support was out there for them. But what we saw was that in that middle ground, from men from their 30s on up, there was nothing to inform them. And what we started to recognize is that it's very difficult to get men to go into a doctor, to go in for a visit. So we said, let's try to have an educational message that not only goes to men, but also goes to the women in their lives. Because as you pointed out earlier, women will talk about breast cancer, they'll talk about health issues, and they'll share information. Men don't. So our focus really is to focus on women and men about this disease and what it is. And we do that by doing a series, and what we're starting here really is a series of interviews of men who have had prostate cancer, of physicians who treat prostate cancer, of young men who suddenly have other prostate problems and issues, and the need for men to understand that this is part of their body that they need to address. So we started the foundation. We certainly have an opportunity for people to make contributions online so that we can go out and speak to men's groups, into hospitals, into organizations, corporations about prostate cancer and what it is, and to be aware of it. So those are the things that we're doing right now. But the idea here is to have many witnesses, if you will, using video, talking about this disease, talking about the need for men to be aware and to be proactive. And that's really what's missing. Guys don't think they need to be proactive, and it's a mistake.
You know, Dennis, it's interesting. When I was in Texas, I had not been there long, and a good friend of mine, well, now a good friend, but colleague at the time, was diagnosed with prostate cancer and ultimately had gone in for surgery. Two things that came from that. Number one, I went to visit him the next day, and by the time I got there, he'd been discharged, which was, okay, wow, well, you have to be Johnny on the spot these days in order to make the visit to the hospital. But the other thing, his name is Tim Durkin, and the other thing that Tim said to me is he said, which I thought was really profound, he said, if you got 50 guys off the street and you ask them, what's your odometer number? Most of them within 1,000 miles could tell you what their odometer is. If you then ask the same 50 people, what's your PSA, you would be hard-pressed to find 5 that could tell them.
And then ask about PSA velocity, you'd probably have 1.
That's correct. And that person probably is because it's like you or me and they had an experience with prostate. So, you know, here's the funny part about it. You know, if you sat back and you said, you know, guys, you need to be aware. I can tell you today what my odometer is on my car. Now, I also can tell you what my PSA is, but then again, I've been treated twice for prostate cancer. But if you don't know enough about your own body to know that number, which is a really good indicator as to whether at least there's something to be concerned with, and then later you find, well, gee, I've got a problem. I'm not saying the problem came because you didn't know the number, but you at least, and Dennis, I applaud you, should go in for the annual physical. It is a simple blood test to get your PSA number, prostate specific antigen. It is a simple blood test, and that number could be the number that will save your life.
Well, you know, one of the problems right now is that the National Task Force, Preventative Task Force, is making recommendations and saying men really don't need to be tested until you're into your 50s or 60s. And one of the problems with that is that if a man is getting prostate cancer in his 40s and he waits until he's 50 or 60, he may not be around to see the benefit of that. So one of the things that we're suggesting is that, you know, men go in and ask for the test. And even if your physician says to you, you really don't need this test, really go after it and insist upon it. And again, you point out that it's not 100% accurate, but it does give you an indication. And if that indication keeps increasing over a number of years, you're saying, you know, there's something here I should be looking at. So it's giving you a direction.
It is, and I'm going to say this. I'm a bit frustrated with modern medical science. We have tests that we can legitimately use to help save our lives, and then you have people say, "Well, I mean, is it really worth it?" Which is money driving the medicine instead of medicine driving our healthcare.
Absolutely.
You know, I mean, it really is incomprehensible. At 47, if I had done nothing until I was 60, I would likely be dead. And I have seen people in my family who died from prostate cancer and friends who died from prostate cancer, and it was not pretty. So I understand I will leave this earth one day, but I don't want to leave with an ugly death that was defined by prostate cancer spreading through my bones.
No, you're, and that's really the message that we're trying to get out to men. Get treated early, understand what it is, be proactive, and all of those things, and support other men. I was at a meeting the other day with about 50 to 60 men, and I indicated that I spoke on prostate cancer. And following that, I had two guys come up to me and say, you know, I've had it too, but I didn't want to tell anybody about it. So there's this wall of silence that surrounds prostate cancer. There's this embarrassment about it by men. And there's this lack of, if I say something or do something, I'm not macho, I'm not manly. And we're more than our prostate in terms of who we are and how we define ourselves.
That's absolutely true. And, you know, I guess I would say, at least from my perspective, and you can chime in as well, you know, the first thing when I was diagnosed with cancer was, oh my gosh, you know, I don't want the C word, and I certainly want to live. Once I figured out that, okay, the probability is I will live and I won't have cancer, then the issue was, well, you know, what about this thing of incontinence and sexual function? And Dennis, I've interviewed probably 125 men. I was working on a book and kind of dropped it, quite frankly, and need to pick it back up since I was now re-diagnosed through the radiation. But I interviewed 125, 127 men about their experience with prostate cancer, and almost across the board, once they determined that they were going to live, everything then focused on sexual function. And as men, you know, especially whenever you go through adolescence and you're into your, you know, early to midlife, sexual function is part of what helps define a man. At least from our perspective, that's what it tends to be.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's a scary thought to think that might be lost. But again, today with medical technology, there are many men who have survived prostate cancer and surgical treatments or radiation treatments, or in my case, both, and who have not necessarily lost sexual function. So I think that's one thing that we certainly can pass along and share, that that is not a guarantee whenever you're treated for dealing with prostate cancer.
And many of the treatments now following surgery and radiation are pretty aggressive in terms of trying to get sexual function back. And for the vast majority of men, I was at a meeting the other day where there was a nurse talking about sexual function and saying that depending upon how active you were beforehand, with today's modern surgery and the techniques, you'll probably return to the same level of activity. And years ago, that was not the case. Now, again, if the cancer does impact the nerve endings and surrounding the prostate, it's going to be a different issue. So again, the reason to certainly be tested early, treated early, and catch it while you can.
Well, Dennis Golden is my guest here today. You are the founder of PCaAware, which is the National Prostate Cancer Awareness Foundation. And, you know, Dennis, I think that it's again, very admirable that you established the foundation and have connected the dots between people like you and I and others that are willing to be vocal and open and talk about the issues of prostate cancer. I know that this is going to be a continued video series, so we will spend time in the future talking about perhaps more detail relative to moving up toward surgery, if in fact that's your form of treatment, or radiation as the case may be. But moving, let's put it this way, going from diagnosis to treatment, I can see that easily as being a video. And then what happens after treatment? What's the first several months versus what's the first couple of years? So that people can start to get at least a practical example of, for people who have gone through that, what you can expect, and some of the things that you can do as a person being treated for prostate cancer to make sure that you get a successful result and that you can be comfortable, Dennis, like you are or like I am, in openly talking about it.
Well, absolutely. And I think, too, what a lot of men don't realize is the impact of diet as a younger age and what that impact can be in later years. So there's many other topics we can speak about. And certainly by talking to other people who have been through this process, you get a very different perspective depending upon who you're talking to and their experiences, because everyone has a unique and different experience. And I think that's one of the major keys, is to recognize that it is an individual disease and it will impact every man differently, and every man can react differently to it.
Well, Dennis, I'd like to close us out in this video with acknowledging two things. Number one, if you are interested in more information, PCaAware, AWARE.org is the website. PCaAware.org is the website. It is the National Prostate Cancer Awareness Foundation. And I think there's two things that are particularly important by going to the website. Number one, if you're interested in more information, the website has great information in it. But above and beyond that, if you need to talk to somebody, there is certainly a telephone number there where you can reach the folks at PCaAware. Above and beyond that, Dennis, you're a professional speaker. You're willing to talk on this particular topic. So those people that are watching the video, I have to say there are a number of meetings that take place within literally companies across the country, large and small, especially those companies that are dominated by male employees. And there could not be a more productive, profound meeting than to have someone come in and talk about men's health. Because if you want to make sure that you have productive employees, you need healthy employees. And considering the vast number of men today that are diagnosed with prostate cancer, to be able to help those employees recognize it, detect it early, and deal with it creates healthy employees and is absolutely good for business. So go to PCaAware.org and contact Dennis, because he and a number of others of us are willing to certainly provide some education to your organization. Dennis, any last words on your end relative to the organization that you have founded, and a final message for men that are watching?
Well, I think you summarized it rather well there, Chuck, in terms of we're actually pulling together a group of professional speakers from the National Speakers Association and around the country. These are men who have gone through the experience, and are willing to get out and to talk to other men, talk to organizations. One of the greatest challenges right now is also within the African American community, because the incidence of prostate cancer among African Americans is some of the highest in the country. I think African American men are 56% more apt to have prostate cancer, and also have it discovered in a much more advanced stage. So again, the ability to go into a company to talk about what this disease is its impact upon their employees as well as the African American community within their organization is really a topic that we really want to get into far more deeply.
My guest is Dennis Golden with PCaAware, the National Prostate Cancer Awareness Foundation, its CEO and founder. My name is Chuck Gallagher. We are both prostate cancer survivors. And as we sign off, the one thing that I would certainly encourage all men to do, be tested, be proactive, and understand that prostate cancer is certainly a curable disease if you are willing to take action. Again, Chuck Gallagher, Dennis Golden, and this is PCaAware.